I'm offering a presentation today on the Alberta tar sands and the imperative of an ontological reconfiguration. And I've got quite a few slides to move through here, so please forgive me if I move a little quickly at some points. There are some images that I need to show you, and I'll have to hop through those somewhat quickly. Oh, I gotta move this. So in 2010, I was living in Canmore, Alberta, which is a beautiful Rocky Mountain town. And it was there that I discovered what I call the human versus mountain phenomenon, in that people have this opportunity to develop a relationship with this brilliant landscape and its diverse ecosystems. And a lot of folks instead tend to treat it as a giant outdoor gym. And I think this really points to a broader incapacity of Albertans and settler colonizers at large to perceive the enchantment inherent in the land bases that sustain us. So it was after one of my own bike rides, just over 10 years ago, that I came home and I watched a documentary about the Indigenous town of Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta. And I learned that Fort Chipewyan, which is downstream from the Alberta tar sands, which is the largest industrial project on Earth, I learned that the Dene and Cree people of this community were being afflicted by disproportionate levels of leukemia, lymphoma, lupus, colon cancer, Graves' disease, and as of 2006, this town of 1,200 people had experienced 5 cases of cholangiocarcinoma, which is a rare bile duct cancer that usually only affects 1 in 100,000 people. So the doctor who diagnosed these illnesses blew the whistle and pointed to the industry upstream, only to be immediately smeared by the federal and provincial government. So I was very upset about this, and I decided to go down to the Royal Bank of Canada, which at the time was the #1 financier of tar sands projects. And I stood on the boulevard with a sign which read, "RBC finances tar sands genocide." Now, this didn't go over well. I was confronted by neighbors, the bank manager came out, eventually the police came and attempted to escort me away, and I stood my ground. But in retrospect, I can see that this was not only was my direct action not impactful, but it was also problematic for a reason that I'm going to bring up towards the end of the presentation. Now we need to answer the question, what are the Alberta tar sands? The Alberta tar sands are a deposit of bitumen, which is a mixture of oil and sand, and it's found beneath 142,000 square kilometers of boreal forest in northern Alberta, with significant deposits in the Athabasca watershed. So here we have the Athabasca River and the boreal forest before the tar sands industry comes in. And here we have industry's work in progress. So companies will come in and they'll clear cut 200,000 trees at a time. They will drain marshes, bogs, and wetlands. They will excavate to depths of up to 75 meters. And the bitumen strip mines in northern Alberta currently cover 953 square kilometers and are growing. It takes 3 to 4 barrels of hot water to make 1 barrel of oil from bitumen, and the wastewater and sludge are pumped into open tailings ponds, which currently span 257 square kilometers. And these ponds, which are more like lakes, are built on muskeg or bogland to an average height of 270 meters with permeable walls that are made of the earth from the mines. And they're presently leaking. This is according to an analysis done by Environmental Defense. They're based on industry data. They're leaking 11 million liters of toxic tailings into the surrounding ecosystems every day. So here's just one more image, just to try and give you a sense of the magnitude of this project. Unrestrained, it will industrialize a forest the size of Florida. So we come to the question, how did we get here? Why is the settler colonial mind in Canada incapable of responding to the tar sands crisis in a rational, ethical, and ecologically minded way? And how might that change? So I seek to shed light, in this presentation, I seek to shed light on a genesis, a genocide, and a genuine hope. So we're going to use Elizabeth Allison's relational spiral of integral ecology, which is comprised of 4 methodological principles: investigate ontology, expand epistemology, explore ethical implications, and contextualize in politics. We'll use these 4 principles in an attempt to better understand the situation in the Alberta tar sands. So, ontology. We will investigate the divergent worldviews of the Dene Chipewyan people and the settler colonial population in Canada. Epistemology. We will consider the different ways of knowing that inform both the Chipewyan and the settler colonial worldview. Ethics. We will explore the ethical implications of the tar sands project with specific attention to treaty rights and industrial genocide. And finally, politics. We will consider the ethical imperative of supporting Indigenous-led resistance through acts of peaceful civil disobedience. So let's hop right into ontology and epistemology. The first thing we need to do is consider the historical roots of the dominant settler colonial ontology and epistemology. And Stephen Harding, in his book Animate Earth, very eloquently explains the role that Descartes and Newton played in inaugurating a mechanistic view of the universe, with Descartes' body-mind duality and Newton's differential calculus, allowing him to predict the movement of objects, the trajectories of objects, rather. Copernicus and Kant also play significant roles. Copernicus because he decentered the human and the cosmos, and Kant because he really defined the limits of subjectivity and emphasized how and why the phenomenal world is beyond our grasp. And I really love this quote from Passion of the Western Mind, Richard Tarnas, saying, the Cartesian Kantian paradigm both expresses and ratifies a state of consciousness in which experience of the unitive numinous depths of reality has been systematically extinguished, leaving the world disenchanted and the human ego isolated. Now, something we need to be aware of is that worldviews historically benefit some people and not others, and we have to ask, who does this disenchanted mechanistic reductionist paradigm serve? And Chris Hedges, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, has something to say about this in his book, Wages of Rebellion. And he brings Walter Benjamin into the conversation. And Benjamin suggests that capitalism is, and I'm quoting him here, an essentially religious phenomenon that no longer seeks to connect humans with the mystery of life. And Hedges bolsters this critique and expresses that technological advancement and wealth are conflated in capitalism with human progress. All aspects of human existence that cannot be measured or quantified, so beauty, truth, love, grief, the search for meaning, the struggle with our own mortality, are ignored and ridiculed. That the Cartesian, Newtonian, or reductionist materialist paradigm serves the profit motive of late-stage extractivist capitalism may very well be an inevitability of their coevolution. It would not be far-fetched to say that at this point, the disenchanted worldview and the capitalist economic system exist in a sort of codependence. They need each other. The commodities of capitalism fill the void that disenchantment opens, and a disenchanted world really requires no defense against the ecocidal extraction of late-stage capitalist enterprise. So Hedges says that he proposes we lack the emotional and intellectual creativity to shut down the engine of global capitalism. And I want to suggest we also lack a vital perceptory capacity that would involve witnessing the widespread presence of subjectivity in the living world. So I offer the diagnosis that the dominant settler colonial ontology and epistemology do not yield a rational, ethical, and ecologically minded response to the tar sands crisis because they do not yield a world worth protecting. Only by evacuating the subjectivity from the world can we justify industrial violence on the scale of the tar sands. So to correct this, we need to develop different habits of mind. And Harding suggests Henry Bortoft's notion of active looking, which is a practice in which we look without reducing the content of our experience or trying to explain it, as a means by which we can redeploy our attention into sense perception and away from the verbal intellectual mind. And in Elizabeth Allison's essay in which she introduces the relational spiral of integral ecology, she also emphasizes the importance of Buddhist-inspired practices such as meditation and non-attachment. And I think ultimately what we require is an epistemological adjustment, and whether it's active looking or meditation that gets us there is irrelevant. What matters is one's willingness to surrender into presence and to learn to know in another way. And so this brings us to the Chipewyan Ontology. And for this overview, I relied heavily on David M. Smith's essay, An Athabascan Way of Knowing, Chipewyan Ontology. So Chipewyan Ontology is heavily based on communication with animals, and animal persons will infuse Chipewyan people with inconze, which is a sort of medicine power. So animal persons will do this in dreams, and they will also do this in waking life, in the dreams of Chipewyan people. Chipewyan ontology is monistic, and Smith tells us there are no sacred, profane, natural, superficial, or material spiritual dualisms. Their epistemology is characterized by percept ambiguity, which means their thought categories are open-ended, and thus waking life and dreams can actually bleed together, and often someone won't know whether they've derived a skill empirically in waking life or whether they've gained a skill through Nkanze that was gifted to them in a dream state. The Western mind might see this as problematic, or at the very least impractical, and the temptation might arise to suggest that the Chipewyan people live in a state of naive participation mystique. I want to suggest that one shouldn't be so fast to position the Chipewyan experience within a Western framework that is largely ignorant of indigenous wisdom and traditions. With the best of intentions, we still may end up engaging in yet another form of colonial incursion. Relationships and reciprocity are a fundamental part of the Chipewyan world, and animal peoples will not give gifts to Chipewyan people unless they're being good to each other and being good to animal persons. And finally, there's a major focus on sensory activation, which is vital for the Chipewyan hunt, which is part of their subsistence way of life. Now, there is another hunt also taking place in northern Alberta, and this is a wolf cull that's been sanctioned by the Alberta government. The reason for this cull is that the tar sands have moved so deep into caribou habitat that the caribou populations are now threatened. So rather than change course with the expansion of the largest industrial project on Earth, the government's colluded with industry to kill wolves by poisoning them with strychnine and shooting them from helicopters. And I'm just going to point out one feature of this, which is that the Chipewyan people are on the ground when they're hunting. And it is their relationships with the animals, with the land, and even with their ancestors that allows them to hunt successfully. Because the settler colonial mind, by contrast, is not practiced in the disciplined sensory immersion, and because settler colonizers also lack the sorts of relationships that define the Chipewyan world, the settler colonial wolf hunter must literally leave the earth in order to shoot the wolves. And I think this very literally symbolizes the Cartesian divide. So Stephen Harding suggests that the anima mundi, or world soul, may lie dormant or suppressed in all of us and awaken as we come to perceive ourselves and others as, well, as he so beautifully calls the earth community, the common flesh of the world. Ultimately, the truth value of this proposition is irrelevant. What matters is its outcome. That said, if an ontology yields healthy relationships of reciprocity, one might be inclined to deduce that it probably reflects some truth about the nature of reality as a participatory venture. And as such, I want to suggest that Western settler colonial culture has something vital to learn from Chipewyan ontology regarding the importance of relationship and sensory immersion in the world. All right, so we're gonna explore ethical implications now. And for this, I want to draw from Laurette Savoy's book, Trace, in which Savoy articulates, if the health of the land is its capacity for self-renewal, then the health of the human family could in part be an intergenerational capacity for locating ourselves within inheritances, as citizens of the land, of nations, even within nations, and of earth. Democracy lies within ever-widening communities. And I will risk speaking on behalf of my fellow settler colonizers when I say that we are deeply fragmented from our historical and social context. To address the crisis that is the Alberta tar sands, we badly need to piece ourselves back together. We need to remember, a term I'm borrowing from Savoy. As it turns out, the process of remembering ourselves is also a process of relationship building, and thus it's an awakening to subjectivity and enchantment. Remembering for settlers involves understanding the history and the present impact of treaties that govern Indigenous settler relations. And well, we don't have time to get too deep into the details here. I will just mention that Treaty 8, which was signed in 1899, forces the surrender of Indigenous land where the tar sands are being developed, and it was a coercive agreement. Essentially, the only choice the Indigenous inhabitants of this land had was to lose their land with a treaty or to lose their land without a treaty. Now, Treaty 8 is worded in such a way as to suggest it protects traditional Indigenous ways of life. But as we learned in the opening of this presentation, the water the people of Fort Chipewyan depend on for survival is being poisoned, along with the fish and the animals that they hunt and trap. And as Jennifer Huseman and Damien Short point out, I'm not going to read this whole quote here, but I'll just draw from the part where they mention that to forcibly alienate Indigenous peoples from their land is an act of genocide. So Canada is engaged in a genocide. We are eliminating a people who are valuable in and of themselves. I want to emphasize that before I move on here. We are eliminating a people who are valuable in and of themselves, but it doesn't end there. In eliminating a people, we are eliminating a way of knowing. And in eliminating a way of knowing, we are eliminating the world that arises through that way of knowing. And tragically, that world is one defined by relationships and reciprocity. And it's the very kind of world we currently need to learn from. So resistance to this destruction becomes an ethical imperative for a plurality of reasons. Okay, we're going to contextualize in politics. And here I want to introduce Sheldon Wallen's term inverted totalitarianism, which means the political coming of age of corporate power and the political demobilization of the citizenry. And I want to point out that the Occupy Wall Street movement that spread across the world in 2011 was very much a reaction to inverted totalitarianism. And it was a very special moment because settler colonizers came together and did something we do not usually do. We gathered, we looked each other in the eye, we listened to each other, we talked to each other, we awoke to each other's subjectivity. And I was present at the Occupy Calgary movement a year after I had my one-person protest in front of the Royal Bank of Canada and experienced this for myself. And it was the sense of consciousness expansion was palpable. And so I want to suggest that mass movements have the power to awaken us to the enchantment of the world, to awaken to the subjectivity that surrounds us. And this image of Liberty Square this is an image of Liberty Square during the Occupy movement. It's drawn from Chris Hedges and the cartoonist Joe Sacco's book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. Hedges spent a lot of time with Occupy, and he really valued the nonviolent component of the movement. And he says, this is a struggle to win over the wider public and those within the structures of power, including the police, who are possessed of a conscience. And I think Hedges is right. I also think it's important we note that advocating for nonviolence can itself become a form of violence if it fails to take into account what self-defense might need to look like in brutally oppressive conditions. Overall, though, I think Hedges offers a cogent analysis, and I do recommend reading him. The one thing that's missing from his analysis is that settler colonizers must follow Indigenous leadership when it comes to resistance to extractive industry. And this is what I failed to do when I protested in front of the Royal Bank of Canada. I never consulted with the people of Fort Chipewyan or asked them what, if anything, they might want me to do to help them. I just did that of my own volition. And yeah, Indigenous people are on the front lines of the tar sand struggle, and they are the ones most affected by it. So we must follow their lead. So with this in mind, I'd like to finish by highlighting the native rights-based strategic framework put forth by Clayton Thomas Muller of the Matthias Colomb Cree Nation. And the basic intention is to put pressure on the Canadian government to respect treaties. And Muller suggests, and I think it's a very bold suggestion, and I don't think he's wrong. He says, we, Indigenous people, are the keystones in a hemispheric social movement strategy that could end the era of big oil and eventually usher in another paradigm from this current destructive age of free market economics. So Muller started the Canadian Indigenous Tar Sands campaign, and I'm going to quote him here again. It involves legal intervention, base building, policy intervention at all levels of government, including the United Nations, narrative-based storytelling strategies in conventional and social media, civil disobedience, popular education, and a whole lot of prayer and ceremony. This is an extraordinary vision, and I want to suggest that when First Nations, the Indigenous people in Canada, put pressure on government to abide by treaty agreements, settler colonizers can, when invited, and I want to stress that, when invited, we can amplify that pressure with mass civil disobedience. The rest of the while, we all have unique skills and gifts we can employ to bring the vision of the native rights-based strategic framework to life. The beauty of such an integral vision is that it has room for all kinds of skill sets and abilities. Everyone has a place in bringing about a new world, and it is this engagement with each other, this coming together, this remembering, this nurturing of relationships, this fostering of reciprocity, this act of re-enchantment that spirals continuously towards clearer and clearer perception of the infinite depths of subjectivity that surround us. So, in conclusion, I'll just sum up real quick that we've established that the mechanistic-reductionist settler colonial worldview synergizes destructively with extractivist capitalist industry. We've looked at how the Chipewyan epistemology and ontology provide insight into how a relational and enchanted worldview might yield a healthier world. We've considered that settler colonizers must actively remember themselves in the context of their colonial history and its present-day implications. And finally, we've considered that Indigenous-led mass movements are opportunities not just for resistance and justice, but also to build relationships and reawaken to the subjectivity and enchantment that pervades the Earth community. And I will wrap it up there. Thank you so much for listening.